She was the last woman left on stage, completely rejected by every man. Then the most dangerous of them all stepped out of the shadows to claim her. The humiliation burned like wildfire through Evelyn's chest as she stood alone on the auction platform, the last woman without a pair in the grand annual ceremony of the mountain community. 26 years of life had led to this moment of crushing rejection, where hundreds of eyes bore into her soul while deafening silence filled the great hall. Her hands trembled against the rough wooden railing as she watched the final woman before her being claimed by a broad-shouldered merchant from the eastern valleys, leaving only empty space and whispered conversations in her wake. The auction had begun at dawn, with the traditional horn call echoing across the stone peaks that surrounded their ancient settlement. Women dressed in their finest ceremonial gowns had lined the platform like precious jewels waiting to be chosen, each one representing months of preparation and family expectations. The aroma of burning cedar and mountain herbs filled the air, mixing with the nervous excitement that always accompanied these sacred gatherings. But as the hours passed and name after name was called, as bid after bid was placed for every other woman present, Evelyn felt her dreams crumbling like autumn leaves in a winter storm. She had prepared for this day since her 18th birthday, 8 long years of waiting and hoping. Her mother had spent countless evenings teaching her the traditional songs, the ceremonial dances, the proper way to hold herself during the presentation. Her father had worked extra seasons in the silver mines to afford the intricate blue dress that now felt like a mockery against her skin. The delicate embroidery that had taken her grandmother 3 months to complete seemed to mock her as she stood unwanted, unclaimed, forgotten by every eligible man in the community. The whispers started softly, like the first drops of rain before a storm. She caught fragments of conversations from the crowd below, words that cut deeper than any blade ever could. "Poor child," someone murmured. "26 and still unmarried." Another voice, sharper and less kind, added, "Perhaps there's a reason she's been passed over so many times." The cruelty in their voices made her stomach twist with shame, but she forced herself to remain upright, to maintain whatever dignity she could salvage from this devastating moment. Elder Marcus, the ceremony leader, shifted uncomfortably on his ceremonial throne, his weathered hands gripping the ancient staff that had overseen these rituals for generations. His eyes, usually kind and understanding, now held a mixture of pity and confusion as he looked upon her isolated figure. The traditional words he was supposed to speak seemed to stick in his throat, as if even he could not comprehend how such a moment had come to pass in their close-knit community. Her mind raced through every possible explanation for her rejection. Was it her tendency to speak her mind when others remained silent? Was it the way she questioned the old traditions instead of accepting them blindly? Perhaps it was her habit of spending hours in the forest, collecting herbs and talking to the mountain spirits that others pretended not to believe in. Or maybe it was simply that she had never learned to make herself smaller, quieter, more palatable to the men who seemed to prefer women who disappeared into the background of their lives. The great hall stretched before her like a cavern of judgment, its stone walls decorated with tapestries, telling stories of successful unions from centuries past. Torch flames danced in their iron holders, casting shifting shadows that seemed to mock her solitary position. The same hall where her parents had met, where her grandparents had pledged their lives to each other, where she had dreamed of finding her own happiness, now felt like a tomb for her hopes and expectations. Just when the silence became unbearable, when she was certain she would collapse from the weight of public humiliation, something shifted in the atmosphere. A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat fields. Conversations died mid-sentence, and even the children stopped their restless shuffling. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop several degrees, raising goosebumps along Evelyn's bare arms, despite the warmth from dozens of torches. From the deepest shadows at the back of the great hall, a figure emerged like something from the mountain legends themselves. Tall and imposing, with shoulders broad enough to block out torchlight, he moved with the fluid grace of a predator stalking through familiar territory. His dark hair caught the firelight as he walked, and his clothes, while fine, bore the practical touches of someone who lived outside the comfortable boundaries of village life. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, silver-gray like storm clouds, scanning the crowd with an intensity that made people step back and lower their gazes. Evelyn knew who he was, though she had never spoken to him directly. Everyone in the mountain regions knew of Darius Blackthorn, the man who lived alone in the highest peaks, who emerged from the wilderness only when necessity demanded it. Stories followed him like shadows, tales of impossible strength, of knowledge about the old ways that even the elders had forgotten, of a past shrouded in mystery and tragedy that no one dared to question openly. Some whispered that he was not entirely human, that he had made pacts with the ancient spirits that still roamed the mountain forests. Others claimed he had lost his mind to grief years ago and was too dangerous for civilized company. He walked through the crowd as if they were merely obstacles in his path, his boots striking the stone floor with measured, deliberate steps. No one spoke, no one moved. The entire assembly seemed frozen in a moment of collective held breath as he approached the platform where she stood. His presence filled the space around him like a physical force, commanding attention and respect through sheer magnetic power that Evelyn could feel even from her elevated position. When he reached the base of the platform, he stopped and looked directly at her for the first time. The impact of his full attention was like being struck by lightning, electric, overwhelming, and impossible to ignore. His eyes held depths she could not fathom, storms of emotion that spoke of experiences far beyond anything she had ever imagined. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the entire world narrowed down to just the two of them, connected by an invisible thread that neither fully understood. "I claim her!" His voice rang out clear and strong, cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. The words were simple, traditional, exactly what should be spoken during such ceremonies. But coming from him, they carried weight that made the very air vibrate with possibilities and consequences that no one in the hall could fully comprehend. The collective gasp from the crowd was audible, a sound like wind rushing through a mountain pass. Elder Marcus nearly dropped his ceremonial staff, his eyes widening in shock and perhaps a touch of fear. Several women in the front rows grabbed their neighbors' arms for support, while men shifted nervously and whispered urgent questions to anyone who might have answers. Children, who had been growing restless during the long ceremony, suddenly became perfectly still, sensing the gravity of what had just occurred, even if they could not understand its implications. Evelyn felt the world tilting beneath her feet, as if the mountain itself was shifting. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard, she was certain everyone could hear it echoing through the suddenly silent hall. This was not how she had imagined this day ending. In her most desperate moments, she had pictured going home alone, facing the pitying looks and whispered comments of neighbors, enduring the crushing disappointment of her family. Never had she imagined that the most mysterious and feared man in all the mountain territories would step forward to claim her as his own. The traditional response should have been immediate acceptance. It was what was expected, what the ceremonies demanded. But looking down at Darius Blackthorn's upturned face, at the storm clouds gathering in his silver eyes, at the way his jaw was set with determination that brooked no argument, Evelyn found herself frozen between terror and something else she could not quite name. Was it hope, relief, or something far more dangerous that whispered of adventures and possibilities that she had never dared to dream? Elder Marcus cleared his throat, the sound echoing strangely in the charged atmosphere. The claiming is acknowledged," he managed to say, though his voice wavered with uncertainty. The words felt heavy with implications that reached far beyond a simple marriage arrangement. This was not just a union being formed, it was the beginning of something that would change the very foundations of their community forever. As Evelyn descended the platform steps on trembling legs, her entire life seemed to compress into this single moment of transformation. Behind her lay the familiar world of expectations and disappointments, of trying to fit into spaces too small for her spirit. Before her waited the unknown, represented by a man whose very presence seemed to promise that nothing would ever be the same again. And somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the fear and uncertainty, a small flame of something that might have been excitement began to flicker to life, though she dared not acknowledge it yet. But what happened in the days that followed would change everything she thought she knew about herself, about love, and about the ancient magic that still flowed through the mountain peaks like blood through living veins. The journey to Darius's mountain home began in absolute silence, broken only by the rhythmic clip-clop of horse hooves against the stone pathway that wound higher and higher into the peaks. Evelyn sat rigidly in the saddle of the mare he had provided, her ceremonial dress now feeling absurdly formal against the wild landscape that surrounded them. Every few minutes, she stole glances at the man riding ahead of her, noting how he seemed to merge with the wilderness around him, as if he belonged to it more than to any human settlement. The path they followed was ancient, carved into the mountainside by hands long dead, and lined with standing stones that bore symbols she could not read. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner and colder, carrying scents of pine, wild herbs, and something else, something primal and untamed that made her pulse quicken with an emotion she could not name. The sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood that seemed to echo the turmoil in her heart. "Are you going to tell me where we're going?" she finally asked, her voice sounding small and uncertain in the vast wilderness. It was the first time either of them had spoken since leaving the village, and her words seemed to hang in the mountain air like physical things. Darius turned slightly in his saddle, giving her a glimpse of his profile against the dying light. "Home," was all he said, but the word carried weight that suggested it meant something different to him than it did to most people. There was something in his tone, loneliness perhaps, or resignation, that made her chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. As darkness began to settle over the mountains like a heavy blanket, she noticed that he navigated the treacherous paths with impossible certainty, as if he could see clearly in conditions that left her straining her eyes to make out shapes in the gloom. When her mare stumbled slightly on loose stones, his hand was immediately there to steady the reins, his reflexes far too quick for an ordinary man. The brief contact of his fingers against hers sent an electric shock up her arm that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air. "Thank you," she whispered, and was rewarded with what might have been the ghost of a smile before he returned his attention to the path ahead. The cabin appeared like something from a fever dream, a structure that seemed to have grown from the mountain itself rather than being built upon it. Constructed of dark stone and weathered timber, it perched on a ledge that offered commanding views of the valleys below, while being sheltered by towering peaks on three sides. Warm light spilled from its windows like golden honey, and smoke rose from a chimney that suggested comfort and warmth waiting within. But there was something about the place that made her skin prickle with awareness, as if the very air around it hummed with barely contained energy. Inside, the cabin was far more comfortable than its rustic exterior suggested. Rich furs covered floors of polished wood, and the furniture, while simple, was crafted with obvious skill and care. A fire crackled in a massive stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with books, dried herbs, and objects she could not immediately identify. The scent of wood smoke mixed with something else, pine, leather, and an underlying musk that she somehow associated with Darius himself. "You must be hungry," he said, and she realized with surprise that she was. The stress of the day had suppressed her appetite, but now, in the relative safety of the cabin, Her body was beginning to make its needs known. She watched as he moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, preparing a simple meal of bread, cheese, and soup that smelled of wild vegetables and herbs she could not name. They ate in silence, but it was not the uncomfortable quiet of the journey. Instead, it felt like the natural peace of two people learning to share space without the need for constant conversation. She found herself studying him more openly now, noting the way firelight played across the sharp angles of his face, the careful way he moved, as if always prepared for some unseen threat. His hands, she noticed, bore scars that spoke of a life far rougher than anything she had experienced in the village. "Why?" she asked suddenly, the question bursting from her lips before she could stop it. "Why did you claim me? You could have had your choice of any woman in the territory. Beautiful women, wealthy women, women who wouldn't question your every decision or challenge traditions that have stood for centuries." He looked at her for a long moment, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight like mirrors. "Perhaps that's exactly why," he said finally. "I've had enough of people who bend like grass in the wind. Sometimes what a man needs is someone strong enough to weather the storms alongside him." The words sent warmth spreading through her chest, but before she could respond, he stood abruptly and moved toward a window that looked out over the mountain ranges. His posture was tense, alert, as if he had heard or sensed something that escaped her notice entirely. "Is everything all right?" she asked, rising from her chair to join him at the window. Outside, the night was clear and still, with stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. But as she stood beside him, she became aware of sounds that had been too subtle to notice from across the room. The distant howl of wolves, the rustle of something large moving through the trees below, the whisper of wind carrying scents and messages that only he seemed able to interpret. "The mountains are restless tonight," he said quietly, and she noticed that his hand had moved instinctively to rest on the handle of a knife at his belt. "They know change is coming." Before she could ask what he meant, he turned away from the window and began extinguishing the lamps one by one. "You should rest," he said. "Tomorrow will bring decisions that cannot be unmade." He showed her to a small room that was clearly meant for guests, with a comfortable bed covered in soft furs and a window that would offer morning views of the eastern valleys. But as she prepared for sleep in the borrowed nightgown he had provided, she found her mind too active to settle. Everything about this day had been beyond anything she could have imagined, and the man who had claimed her remained as much a mystery as when she had first seen him emerge from the shadows. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams that were vivid and strange. She found herself running through moonlit forests, her bare feet silent on paths of moss and fallen leaves. In her dreams, she was faster than she had ever been in waking life, stronger, more alive than she had ever felt before. And always just at the edge of perception, there was a presence keeping pace with her, something wild and powerful that she somehow knew would protect her from any danger the night might bring. She woke to the sound of voices outside the cabin, urgent and angry tones that made her heart race, even before she was fully conscious. Dawn light was streaming through the window, painting everything in shades of gold and rose. The voices grew closer, and she recognized Elder Marcus's distinctive tone, though his words were too muffled by the cabin walls to make out clearly. Dressing quickly in the simple clothes Darius had left for her, she crept to the main room to find him standing by the door, every line of his body radiating controlled tension. He was dressed for travel, with a heavy cloak draped over his shoulders and that ever-present knife at his side. When he heard her footsteps, he turned, and she was struck by how different he looked in the morning light. Younger somehow, but also more dangerous, like a wild animal that had been temporarily tamed but never fully domesticated. "They've come for you," he said simply, as if he had been expecting this moment from the beginning. "The village council. They're questioning the validity of the claim, saying that proper procedures weren't followed, that you should be given the chance to refuse." Through the window, she could see the delegation that had climbed the treacherous mountain paths before dawn. Elder Marcus was there, along with several other council members and, her heart sank, her own parents. Her mother's face was streaked with tears, while her father stood with the rigid posture of a man trying to maintain dignity in an impossible situation. "What do you want to do?" Darius asked, and she realized with surprise that he was actually giving her a choice. After everything that had happened, after claiming her so dramatically in front of the entire community, he was prepared to let her walk away, if that was what she desired. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She did not want to walk away. Not from this place that felt more like home after one night than the village had after 26 years. Not from this man who looked at her as if she were something precious and strong rather than something to be pitied or endured. But wanting something and being brave enough to fight for it were two entirely different things. "I want to know the truth," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "About you, about this place, about why the mountains feel more alive when you're near them. I want to know why the village elders look at you with fear instead of respect, and why you've spent years living alone on this peak like some sort of exile." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or approval. "The truth is not always a comfortable thing to live with," he warned. "Once you know certain things about this world, about the forces that move beneath the surface of ordinary life, you can never go back to the safety of ignorance." Outside, Elder Marcus's voice grew louder, more insistent. Soon they would demand entry, would expect explanations and justifications that she was not prepared to give. The weight of their expectations, their traditions, their need for her to conform to patterns that had been established long before she was born, pressed against her like a physical force. "Then show me," she said, moving to stand directly in front of him. "Show me the truth, whatever it is. I've spent my entire life being what other people expected me to be, and where has it gotten me? Standing alone on an auction platform, unwanted and discarded. Maybe it's time I discovered what I actually am instead of what I'm supposed to be." For a moment that stretched between them like an eternity, Darius studied her face as if trying to read her very soul. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached out and took her hand in both of his. His skin was warm despite the morning chill, and rough with calluses that spoke of hard work and harder living. But it was the way he held her, carefully, as if she was something infinitely valuable that might shatter if mishandled, that made her breath catch in her throat. "Then come with me," he said quietly. "But know this. Once you step through that door as my chosen companion rather than their dutiful daughter, everything changes. There will be no going back to the safety of their expectations, no return to the comfortable prison of village life. Are you certain you're ready for that kind of freedom?" The voices outside grew more demanding, more urgent. Soon they would break down the door if necessary, would drag her back to the life she had always known, the life that felt like slow suffocation compared to the wild possibilities that seemed to swirl around Darius like invisible storms. The choice was hers, and it would determine not just her immediate future, but the entire shape of the woman she would become. Looking into his storm-gray eyes, seeing her own reflection there, transformed into something stronger and more alive than she had ever been before, Evelyn made her decision. But what happened when she opened that door and faced the delegation waiting outside would test everything she thought she knew about courage, loyalty, and the price of choosing love over safety. Evelyn's hand trembled as she reached for the door handle, but her voice was steady when she called out to the delegation waiting beyond. "I hear you, Elder Marcus. Give me a moment to prepare myself." The words carried across the morning air with a strength that surprised even her, and she felt Darius's approving gaze like warmth against her back. When she finally opened the door, the sight that greeted her was both familiar and alien. Her parents stood with the rigid posture of people trying to maintain dignity in an impossible situation, while Elder Marcus clutched his ceremonial staff as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. Behind them, 3 other council members shifted nervously, their eyes darting between her face and the imposing figure of Darius, who had moved to stand protectively behind her left shoulder. "Evelyn, my child," Elder Marcus began, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had guided their community for decades. "We've come to discuss the irregularities of yesterday's claiming ceremony. There are procedures that must be followed, traditions that cannot simply be ignored," she interrupted, feeling a surge of strength flow through her that seemed to come from some deep, untapped well within her soul. Like the tradition that says every woman deserves to be valued. Like the procedure that ensures fair treatment for all members of our community. Her words hung in the crisp mountain air like accusations, and she saw several of the council members flinch at their implications. Her mother stepped forward, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Please, sweetheart, just come home with us. We can arrange another ceremony, speak to eligible men from the neighboring territories. This doesn't have to be the end of everything." The desperation in her voice was heartbreaking, but Evelyn found that her resolve only strengthened in response. "And what if they reject me too, Mother? What if I spend another 8 years waiting for someone to decide I'm worthy of love? How many more auction platforms must I stand on before you realize that maybe, just maybe, the problem isn't with me, but with a system that treats women like livestock to be appraised and purchased?" The words came from some place inside her that had been silently building pressure for years, and now that the dam had broken, she found she could not stop the flood. "I've spent my entire life trying to fit into spaces too small for my spirit, trying to make myself acceptable to people who would rather see me diminished than challenged. Well, I'm done with that. I'm done being ashamed of who I am." Elder Marcus raised his staff, the gesture commanding attention through generations of conditioning. "Child, you speak of things you do not understand. This man," he gestured toward Darius with obvious distaste, "is not what he appears to be. There are rumors, stories from the old times that speak of what?" Darius's voice cut through the elder's words like a blade through silk, quiet, but carrying enough menace to make several people step backward. "Speak plainly, old man. What accusations do you bring against me?" The silence that followed was pregnant with tension and ancient fears. Finally, it was Councilman Henrik who found his voice, though it wavered with uncertainty. "They say you commune with the old spirits, that you're bound to the mountain in ways that aren't natural. There are those who claim you're not entirely human." Instead of denying the accusation, Darius smiled, and the expression was both beautiful and terrifying. "And if that were true, would it make me less worthy of companionship? Less capable of love?" He moved to stand beside Evelyn, his presence radiating power that seemed to make the very air around them shimmer with possibilities. "Your fears betray you, Henrik. You're not concerned about her welfare. You're afraid of losing control over something you never owned in the first place." Evelyn felt something shift within her as he spoke, as if his words were awakening parts of herself that had been sleeping for decades. The morning light seemed brighter, the mountain air cleaner and more alive in her lungs. When she looked at her hands, she could swear she saw faint traces of silver light dancing beneath her skin, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. "There's something else," she said quietly, and everyone present turned to look at her with varying degrees of surprise and concern. "Something I discovered about myself, about my family history that changes everything." She took a deep breath, drawing strength from Darius's steady presence beside her. "My grandmother wasn't just an herbalist who was exiled for practicing forbidden arts. She was something more, wasn't she, Elder Marcus?" The old man's face went pale, and his grip on his ceremonial staff tightened until his knuckles showed white against weathered skin. "Evelyn, there are some secrets that are better left buried with the dead. "Not anymore," she replied, feeling power rising within her like sap climbing a tree in spring. "I can feel it, you know. The gift she passed down through my bloodline. It's been growing stronger every day since I arrived on this mountain, and I think it's time everyone knew the truth about what runs in my veins." To demonstrate her point, she held out her hand palm up and concentrated on the feeling of energy that had been building within her since dawn. Slowly, deliberately, a small flame appeared in her palm, not the orange-red of ordinary fire, but silver-white like captured moonlight. The flame danced and flickered without burning her skin, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of its light. The collective gasp from the delegation was audible, and her mother actually stumbled backward into her father's arms. But it was Elder Marcus's reaction that confirmed what she had begun to suspect. His expression was not one of surprise, but of recognition, as if he had been expecting this moment for years. "She has the sight," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the mountain wind. "Just like her grandmother before her, just like the women who were cast out during the purification trials 50 years ago. The women who were murdered," Darius corrected, his voice carrying deadly quiet that made everyone present freeze in place. "Let's not prettify history with gentle euphemisms, Marcus. Your predecessors killed anyone who showed signs of the old gifts, didn't they? Burned them as witches and heretics to maintain control over a population that might otherwise have remembered what real power looked like." Evelyn closed her fist, extinguishing the flame, but she could still feel its warmth pulsing beneath her skin like a second heartbeat. "Is that what you came here to do? To drag me back so you could silence me the way you silenced my grandmother?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and she saw truth in the way several council members refused to meet her eyes. "Your grandmother left of her own accord," Elder Marcus protested, but his words lacked conviction. "She understood that her gifts were dangerous, that they threatened the stability of our community. She left because you gave her no choice," Evelyn shot back, memories that were not her own flooding through her consciousness like water through a broken dam. "Because you told her that if she stayed, if she continued to use her abilities to heal the sick and speak with the spirits, you would ensure that the same fate befell her daughter, my mother. She sacrificed her home, her family, her entire life to protect the people she loved from your fear and ignorance." The silver light was spreading now, no longer confined to her palms, but flowing beneath her skin like liquid starlight. She could feel the mountain responding to her presence, ancient spirits stirring in the deep places where stone met sky. The standing stones along the path began to resonate with harmonic frequencies that only she and Darius seemed able to hear, and the very air around them started to shimmer with barely contained energy. "You want to know the truth about your traditions," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "They're built on the bones of women like me, women who were destroyed for the crime of being more than what small-minded men could understand or control. Well, I won't be another sacrifice on the altar of your comfort and conformity." Darius moved closer to her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, and she realized that he too was changing. His eyes had taken on an otherworldly silver gleam, and when he smiled, she caught a glimpse of teeth that were slightly too sharp to be entirely human. Power called to power, recognizing kinship across the boundaries of species and tradition. "There's more," he said, addressing the delegation but never taking his eyes off her face. "She's not just gifted with the sight, she's my mate in ways that transcend your human ceremonies and contracts. The mountain spirits themselves have blessed our union, and no earthly authority has the right to challenge what the ancient powers have sanctioned." As if summoned by his words, the wind began to pick up, carrying scents of pine and wildflowers mixed with something wilder, something that spoke of creatures that had never bowed to human dominion. In the distance, wolves began to howl, their voices creating harmonies that seemed to echo from every peak and valley surrounding them. The sound raised goosebumps along Evelyn's arms, but instead of fear, she felt a deep sense of recognition, as if she were finally hearing the songs her soul had been waiting for her entire life. "This is madness," her father spoke for the first time, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Evelyn, you're talking about giving up everything, your family, your community, your place in civilized society. For what? For mysteries and magic that may not even be real?" She looked at him with eyes that now held flecks of the same silver light that danced beneath her skin. "For the chance to be who I actually am, instead of who you need me to be. For the opportunity to use gifts that have been suppressed and denied for generations. For love that sees my strength as a blessing instead of a burden to be managed." The delegation huddled together, whispering urgently among themselves, while she and Darius stood united against their fears and prejudices. She could hear fragments of their conversation, words like dangerous and unnatural and corruption, but they seemed to be coming from very far away, as if she were listening to the concerns of beings from another world entirely. Finally, Elder Marcus stepped forward one last time, his ceremonial robes fluttering in the increasingly strong wind. "If you choose to stay with him, if you choose to embrace these abilities, then you can never return to the village. The community cannot risk the kind of chaos that your presence would bring. You would be exiled, just as your grandmother was, cut off from everything and everyone you've ever known." Evelyn felt the weight of the moment settling around her like a mantle, heavy with consequences that would ripple forward through the rest of her life. But when she looked at Darius, when she saw the way he watched her with eyes that promised adventure and acceptance and a love that would never ask her to diminish herself, the choice became surprisingly simple. "Then that's a price I'm willing to pay," she said, reaching out to take his hand in hers. The moment their skin touched, power flowed between them like electricity, and she felt something click into place deep in her soul. As if she had been incomplete her entire life without realizing it. "I choose him. I choose this path. I choose to become who I was always meant to be." The silver light that had been building beneath her skin suddenly blazed forth, surrounding both of them in a cocoon of luminous energy that made the delegation shield their eyes and step backward. When the light faded, Evelyn knew that she had been fundamentally changed, transformed into something that was both more and different than what she had been before. She could feel the mountain's approval in the way the wind gentled around them, could hear the spirits singing welcome songs in voices only she could understand. As the delegation retreated down the treacherous mountain path, carrying with them the news that would forever change how her story was told in the valley below, Evelyn stood hand in hand with the man who had seen her true worth when no one else could. The morning sun painted the peaks in shades of gold and rose, and she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them as herself, powerful, gifted, and finally, completely free.